Let me tell you something strange about people who avoid conflict at all costs. We live in a world that celebrates confrontation, where speaking up is seen as strength and silence as weakness. Maybe you're one of them, and maybe no one has ever explained why your chest tightens at the first sign of disagreement, why you'd rather disappear than defend yourself. If you want to understand what you feel without labels and have language to explain yourself without justifying, subscribe. Here we translate psychology into relief, not diagnosis. This isn't about fixing you, it's about seeing you clearly for the first time. The world calls this cowardice. But what if it's the opposite? What if avoiding conflict is a form of silent self-preservation? A kind of emotional intelligence the world hasn't learned to recognize. These people aren't weak. They're hyper-aware. They've calculated the cost of every battle and decided their peace is worth more than being right. They possess something rare, the ability to see 10 steps ahead in an argument and realize that winning changes nothing. It's not submission. It's wisdom wearing the mask of surrender. They carry 3 invisible virtues the world mistakes for flaws. First, profound empathy. They feel the weight of other people's pain so intensely that causing it becomes unbearable. Second, long-term thinking. They understand that relationships are ecosystems, not battlegrounds, and every conflict leaves scars that take years to heal. Third, internal congruence. Their sense of self doesn't depend on external validation or proving points. They know who they are even when the world misreads their silence as agreement. We live in a culture that rewards the opposite, where presence has become synonymous with aggression and peace looks like passivity. Speak up or disappear. Fight back or admit defeat. But maybe the real noise is this: having to prove your worth through confrontation, having to defend your existence like it's always on trial. The modern world runs on conflict. Social media rewards outrage. Workplaces celebrate those who push back. Families admire the loud ones who always have an opinion. And somewhere in that chaos, people who avoid conflict pay a silent tax. They're called pushovers, doormats, too sensitive. They're told to grow a backbone, to stand up for themselves, as if their worth is measured by how many arguments they win. The comparison is constant and crushing. Everyone else seems comfortable with confrontation. Everyone else can argue without their hands shaking, disagree without feeling like they're ending a relationship. The social pressure builds like water behind a dam. But here's what nobody says: that pressure isn't just external, it's internal too. Because these people don't just fear conflict with others, they fear the conflict within themselves, the war between who they are and who the world demands they become, between their natural rhythm and the culture's drumbeat. They experience what psychologists call chronic self-monitoring, constantly scanning for signs of disapproval, adjusting their words and actions to maintain harmony. It's exhausting, not because they're weak, but because they're carrying everyone else's emotional weather. And the dopamine never comes. While others get a rush from winning arguments, from the satisfaction of being right, conflict avoiders get only dread. Their nervous system learned long ago that confrontation brings danger, not reward. So they've built an entire architecture of behavior around prevention. They become masters of deflection, experts in reading rooms, specialists in making themselves small enough to slip through tension unnoticed. It's not strategy. It's survival, dressed as politeness. Psychologists call this conflict aversion, a learned behavioral pattern rooted in attachment theory and early relational dynamics. It's the tendency to prioritize relational harmony over personal needs, often developed in environments where conflict was either explosive or emotionally abandoning. In simpler terms, it's when your body learned that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. These people developed what's known as an internal locus of peace. Their sense of safety depends not on external circumstances, but on maintaining calm at any cost. But here's the deeper truth. This isn't just about fear. It's about emotional regulation, at the highest level. Conflict avoiders have something many aggressive people lack: the ability to hold tension without reacting, to feel anger without weaponizing it, to disagree internally without needing the world to know. They possess what researchers call distress tolerance, the capacity to sit with discomfort instead of discharging it onto others. That's not weakness, that's extraordinary self-control. They've also developed hyper-empathy, a kind of emotional radar that picks up on subtle shifts in tone, body language and energy before conflict even surfaces. While others are still forming their argument, conflict avoiders have already mapped the emotional fallout, calculated the relational cost, and decided it's not worth it. They're not avoiding the fight because they can't handle it. They're avoiding it because they can see through it. They understand something profound. Most conflicts aren't about the topic at hand. They're about ego, about being heard, about old wounds dressed as current disagreements. In other words, they know how to exist without needing to be right. And in a world addicted to winning, that kind of surrender looks like defeat. But it's actually freedom. Freedom from the exhausting cycle of defend, attack, defend. Freedom from needing every interaction to validate their existence. They've learned what takes most people a lifetime to understand. You can disagree with someone and still love them. You can be wrong and still be worthy. You can lose the argument and keep your peace. But of course, not all of this comes from wisdom. Sometimes it comes from fear. Sometimes it's not about choosing peace. It's about being terrified of anger, of rejection, of being seen as difficult or demanding. Sometimes conflict avoidance is a defense mechanism built in childhood when speaking up meant punishment or emotional withdrawal. When love felt conditional on being easy, on not making waves, on swallowing your truth to keep everyone else comfortable. And that's the painful part, because beneath the apparent calm, there's often a war raging, a voice that wants to scream but has learned to whisper, a self that wants to exist fully but has been trained to take up less space. These people often carry what therapists call unexpressed anger. Years of swallowed words, unspoken boundaries, moments when they chose silence over self-advocacy. That anger doesn't disappear. It turns inward. It becomes anxiety, depression, a chronic sense of being unseen. Sometimes conflict avoidance is people-pleasing in disguise. It's the belief that their worth depends on keeping others happy, that love is something earned through accommodation rather than something given freely. They become emotional chameleons, shape-shifting to match whatever the room needs, losing themselves in the process. And the exhaustion is real, because you can't maintain peace for everyone without sacrificing your own. But here's what matters. Even when conflict avoidance comes from fear, even when it's rooted in old pain, it's still a form of protection. It's still the psyche trying to keep you safe the only way it knows how, and that deserves compassion, not judgment. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't speaking up. Sometimes it's admitting that you've been silent for too long and that the conflict you've been avoiding isn't with others, it's with yourself. It's the reckoning between who you've become to survive and who you actually are beneath all that accommodation. Avoiding noise isn't isolation. It's boundary setting. Staying quiet isn't weakness. It's choosing your battles. Walking away isn't surrender. It's knowing your peace matters more than proving a point. People who avoid conflict aren't running from life. They're protecting what's left of themselves in a world that demands they constantly fight for their right to exist. They've learned that not every provocation deserves a response, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to engage. Not every silence is empty. Some silence is full of thoughts too complex for an argument, feelings too deep for a debate, truths too personal to defend in public. These people have rich inner worlds that don't need external validation to exist. They process complexity in ways that confrontation can't touch. They understand that some things are sacred, and sacredness requires protection from the noise. They're not passive, they're discerning. They've learned to save their voice for moments that matter, for people who listen. for conversations that heal instead of harm. And there's something almost spiritual in that restraint. In a culture of constant reaction, of hot takes and immediate responses, choosing not to engage becomes a radical act. It's the refusal to let other people's chaos become your own. It's the recognition that you don't owe everyone an explanation, a defense, a piece of your energy. These people have learned what takes most of us decades, that you can't control how others see you, but you can control how much access they have to your peace. Because here's the truth nobody tells you. The people who avoid conflict aren't afraid of fighting. They're afraid of what fighting costs. They've seen relationships destroyed over who said what, families fractured over who was right, friendships ended over misunderstandings that could have been let go. They've done the math, and they've decided that their inner calm, their sense of self, their capacity to sleep at night, all of that matters more than winning. That's not cowardice. That's knowing the price of everything and choosing what's actually valuable. A person like this once tried to be different. They watched the confident ones, the people who could argue passionately without their voice shaking, who could disagree and still sleep soundly. So they practiced. They forced themselves into confrontations, spoke up when everything in them screamed to stay quiet, defended boundaries they weren't sure they had the right to set. And it felt wrong, not empowering, suffocating, like wearing clothes that didn't fit, speaking words in a language that wasn't theirs. The exhaustion was immediate and total. After every confrontation, even the necessary ones, they needed days to recover. They replayed every word, analyzed every reaction, wondered if they'd been too much or not enough. The world told them this was growth, that discomfort meant progress. But it didn't feel like growth. It felt like violence against their own nature. They realized something crucial. They weren't afraid of conflict because they were weak. They were sensitive to it because they felt its ripples more deeply than others did. When they finally accepted their own rhythm, something shifted. Not permission to be walked over, but clarity about what was worth their energy. They learned to distinguish between healthy boundaries and unnecessary battles. They discovered they could protect themselves without aggression, could say no without explanation, could disagree silently, and still maintain their integrity. Studies show that people with high conflict avoidance often have stronger long-term relationships, lower stress hormones, and better emotional regulation. They're not avoiding life, they're navigating it with a different compass. But the most beautiful part wasn't the research, it was the peace. The moment they stopped apologizing for their nature and started honoring it. When they realized that their aversion to conflict wasn't a flaw to fix, but a feature to understand. They learned to build lives that matched their nervous system, careers where collaboration mattered more than competition, relationships where emotional safety was the foundation, spaces where their quietness was respected rather than questioned. It wasn't performance anymore, it was homecoming. It's not about closing yourself off, it's about choosing when to open. You can say this without shame. I value harmony, but that doesn't mean I don't have boundaries. I just enforce them differently than you might expect. That's self-knowledge, not weakness. You can explain, I process conflict internally first. Give me time and I'll come back with clarity instead of reaction. That's maturity, not avoidance. There's a difference between conflict avoidance and doormat behavior, and the distinction matters. Avoiders aren't passive, they're strategic. They pick their battles with surgical precision. They know that most conflicts resolve themselves if you give them space, that most arguments are really about something else, that most provocations are tests you don't have to pass. They've learned what psychologists call selective engagement, the art of knowing when your voice will make a difference and when it will just add to the noise. You can practice this vocabulary. I need to think about this before responding becomes your shield against reactive conflict. I hear you, and I see this differently, allows disagreement without war. This isn't the right time for me to engage with this. Protects your peace without explanation. These aren't scripts for weakness. They're tools for people who understand that communication isn't about winning. It's about being understood on your own terms. And here's the radical part. You don't owe anyone confrontation, not even when they demand it, not even when they call your silence problematic. Some people are addicted to conflict, to the adrenaline of argument, to the satisfaction of making you react, and you're allowed to refuse that game. You're allowed to be the person who doesn't take the bait, who doesn't feed the drama, who walks away from fights that serve no one. That's not capitulation. That's sovereignty over your own energy, your own nervous system, your own life. Not every absence is emptiness. Sometimes it's the place where the soul remembers how to breathe, where the noise finally stops and you can hear yourself think. Maybe avoiding conflict isn't about running from others. Maybe it's about running toward yourself, toward the version of you that exists before the world demanded you fight for your right to be soft, to be careful, to be someone who values peace over being right. And maybe these people aren't broken at all. Maybe they're just wired for a world that doesn't exist yet, a world where gentleness isn't mistaken for weakness, where choosing silence is respected as wisdom, where you don't have to defend your sensitivity like it's a crime. They're the canaries in the coal mine of human aggression, showing us what we lose when we make conflict our primary form of communication. They're modeling something the rest of us forgot, that you can be strong and soft simultaneously, that boundaries don't require raised voices, that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who've thought the deepest. Because here's what the world gets wrong. Conflict avoidance isn't about fear of other people. It's about fidelity to yourself. It's knowing that every time you engage in a meaningless argument, you abandon a piece of your peace. Every time you fight to prove a point, you lose touch with what actually matters. These people have made a sacred choice to protect their inner world from the chaos of external validation, to be misunderstood rather than compromise their nature, to lose the argument and keep their soul. So maybe the question isn't why they avoid conflict. Maybe it's why the rest of us are so addicted to it, why we've built a culture where aggression is rewarded and gentleness is punished, why we've forgotten that some of the strongest people in history changed the world not through confrontation, but through persistent, quiet resistance, not through winning arguments, but through living their truth so completely that it became undeniable. That's the power conflict avoiders hold, not in the fights they win, but in the fights they refuse to have. Which part of you has the world never understood, but in silence you learned to respect? Was it your need for processing time, your sensitivity to emotional atmospheres, your desire for peace over victory? What if that thing you've been apologizing for your entire life is actually the most honest part of you? What if your conflict avoidance isn't a disorder to overcome, but a boundary to honor? Think about it. Every time someone called you too sensitive, were they really saying you felt too much, or that your feelings made them uncomfortable with their own numbness? Every time someone told you to speak up, were they actually hearing your silence or projecting their own need for noise? Maybe you've been receiving criticism that was never really about you. Maybe you've been trying to fix something that was never broken. The people who avoid conflict aren't the problem. The problem is a world that can't distinguish between peace and passivity, between thoughtfulness and fear, between strategic silence and voicelessness. These people know something profound that aggressive communicators haven't learned yet, that not every thought needs to be spoken, not every feeling needs to be defended, not every disagreement needs to be resolved. Some things are meant to be held in the quiet space of your own knowing. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. If this video gave you words to understand what you've always felt, subscribe. Here we talk about what the world never knew how to name, but you always felt. This is where psychology meets poetry, where your confusion finds clarity, where your silence finally gets the respect it deserves, because you're not too sensitive, you're not a coward, you're not broken, you're just someone who values peace in a world that profits from war. And that makes you rare. That makes you necessary. That makes you exactly what we need.